This is rural Galloway, spinners of yarns, a special with Martin Galloway, who happens to be my father, with regards his philosophy on education. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Roel, my son.
Uh, just wanted to get to your philosophy with regards community schools and education, but I think it's quite important to get the grounding of where you went to school yourself and a bit about your family. So, where were you born?
I was born in Middlesbrough, but my parents were born at the beginning of the 1901 and 1902, and they were born in the industrial streets of Middlesbrough, and their parents had moved there because of the possibilities of having a house, a modern house, even though it was an industrial terrace, and also that there would be work as well because of the steelworks that were developing. They discovered iron ore in the hills, and steelworks had started, and it very rapidly became a very big industry, even to the point of producing all the steel for the Sydney Bridge. So it became very, very important. But living circumstances were very hard for my parents at that time because there was incredible pollution, soot everywhere, smoke, soot. Houses were heated by coal fires, and none of these houses had bathrooms. So it was a hard life. And my parents were fortunate enough to have the wherewithal and the ability to move out and get into the modern part of Middlesbrough. So I was brought up on the outskirts of Middlesbrough, nearer to the countryside.
And where was that exactly?
Well, there was an arterial road that came out of Middlesbrough, and it was called Martin Road. It went to a small village, which was historically important for because Captain Cook came from that area. But the actual house was almost 3 miles from the centre of Middlesbrough itself.
And you went to a primary school before you went to Acklam, and
Yes,
Acklam was a grammar school.
Yes, I went to Beechwood Primary School, and that was just after the war because I was born in '37, so I was born a couple of years before the war started, and I do have recollections of air raids and air raid shelters and. In fact, Middlesbrough was the first place that the Luftwaffe bombed in that war because they wanted to damage the steelworks, of course. And also, Middlesbrough was pretty close across the North Sea to where they were taking off. So the first bombs were actually exploded in Middlesbrough itself. The accuracy wasn't particularly good, though.
So how did you end up going to grammar school?
Well, in those days, I mean, it was all a little bit new, and everything was a little bit uh, new because people had been through the war. It's a little bit like being locked down. So when they were coming out, I was at a primary school, and the system then had just been, I don't know when it was developed exactly, for taking an exam called 11 plus. And if you passed the 11 plus, you went to one of two grammar schools in Middlesbrough, either the high school or Acklam Hall. And I somehow finished up in Acklam Hall Secondary Grammar School.
But you had to take an exam to get into Acklam.
That was the 11 plus.
Yeah.
All children in their last year of the primary school took the 11 plus exam, and the majority of them went to just secondary schools. But those who passed the exam was like a top 12% went to the grammar schools.
So during your time at the grammar school, when did you consider where your future lay?
Well, that was a difficult question, because at grammar school you had careers advisors who suggested what you should do, and that was generally based very simply on what success you had in the various subjects that the school taught. So my family were sort of saturated in education and schooling, because my father became a primary school head teacher. My mother eventually went into teaching in infant schools, and my sister was a teacher of special needs in primary schools. So, and all of their friends who came to the house were largely teachers. So most of the conversation around the table was about schools and education. So that was firmly implanted in my mind that I wanted to go forward into education and teaching. It was no problem for me to decide. However, because of careers advice, I was told that was really not suitable for me, and they suggested I should follow a career in architecture, which sounded quite exciting, although it wasn't my idea, but I followed that.
So you went to university in Liverpool?
Yes, we looked at, it was suggested that I go to Liverpool. It apparently had a reputation for being the best architectural university in the country. So why not? So yeah, I went to Liverpool as advised, and I was there for 2 years.
But you didn't enjoy architecture?
It wasn't the architecture that I didn't enjoy. I thought that the delivery in the university was seriously lacking. And my arrival at the School of Architecture was something of a shocking disaster, because it was like a private school initiation ceremony where all the students were taken out. They had their clothes taken off them, apart from their underpants, because they were told they needed a medical. And then they were pushed on the stage to perform to a screaming audience of senior students from the School of Architecture. Even the two girls as well had their clothes partly removed. And to me, it was a bit of a horror story. But then the actual teaching was supported only by lecturing, and we had no contact really with the professors of architecture at all. We were just given projects, but nobody seemed to want to work in the studios. So everybody just worked in their lodgings or wherever they were. So there was no contact. And also the senior students, there was no benefit from the senior students, because they were all um, hidden away in their own procedures. They had no interest in, younger students. So to me, it was a very negative experience. So after the second year, I took my university, the School of Architecture exams. It was all done in a week, Monday morning, afternoon, Tuesday morning, day after day. And then when it was finished, I went to the art college at Liverpool and was accepted there to continue. But my authority, which was Middlesbrough, were not prepared to pay a grant for me to study in Liverpool. So I went to Middlesbrough College of Art.
So when you went to the art college in Middlesbrough, did you have that take into consideration what you were going to do as a career from that point?
No, I always had that idea. I mean, I reverted to the concept of being going into education anyway when I was studying as an architect, and I went to the art college at Liverpool with that in mind, that I would use art as a vehicle for teaching, as opposed to, go to an art college to become an artist. So when I went to Middlesbrough, I still had this concept that I would go into art teaching. And our Middlesbrough Art College experience was quite the opposite of what happened at the University of Liverpool, in that we had contact with all the other students. We were a united body. We had the run of the art college from morning to night, and the students themselves ran all the activities. So, we had debating societies, sporting groups, etc., etc. We organized dances and all sorts of events. And the art went on as well, but with very little interference from the lecturers. Some of them were very close to the students. Some of them really left the students to their own devices. And so we were responsible for our own education, and it was a total education because it went beyond the subject of art.
So once you finished art college, you had to do teacher training.
Yeah, in order to get a full qualification to teach, there was another year to be done for teacher training to become a qualified teacher. So there were options of where to go to, but I chose Hornsey and went to Hornsey Art College Department of Teaching for a year. And it was an interesting experience because within that year, there were 12 weeks of teaching practice to be done by all of the students. And I was sent to the University School, Hampstead, and they told me that they didn't want to send anybody there, but the University College had pleaded with them to have a student. And when I got there, I discovered that it was a school that was used by many of the ministers in Parliament at the time, and certainly wasn't a typical state grammar school. It was a school which was, I suppose, a public school, or we call them private schools. And I learned an awful lot there. I learned also that the reason why they were desperate to have a student teacher is that the art teacher stayed throughout my time, the 12 weeks, in his study. And it turned out that he was a professional guitar maker. And he was the only one making Spanish guitars and inlaying them. So he needed somebody to do his teaching for him. Also, when I first went to the school to have a look round, I met somebody who'd been at my grammar school, just coincidentally. I didn't know he was going to be there. He took me into the staff room, and this was 10 o'clock in the morning, and said to me, "What do you want to drink?" And at that point, I realized there was a group of teachers all standing around having drinks. This is alcoholic drink at 10 o'clock in the morning, which was absolutely extraordinary. But I survived the 12 weeks, and then completed my year at Hornsey, and then started a teaching career in Middlesbrough.
So what was your first school that you taught at in Middlesbrough?
The first one was a school called Springfield, which was, in those days, it was a secondary modern school. And it was on the outskirts of Middlesbrough. There were a lot of housing estates, and Middlesbrough had spread for miles outside of the centre. And I was at the school for 5 years, I think, before I moved on to what was my old grammar school that had become a high school. It had changed its principles, and the principles were, at the time, very strange, that any parent who wanted their child to possibly go on to a career or university could choose to ask if their child could go to this school. It wasn't as a consequence of taking an exam like an 11+. There was no 11+ by that time. I had an interview with a head teacher, and I told him what my principles of education were, and he said it's all very exciting. And so I started teaching there, but all the exciting things that I really wanted to do, of course, didn't happen. And it was clear that it was just simply had many of the principles of a grammar school. And I recall the deputy head speaking to the parents as I walked past the hall once, informing the parents as to which subjects were important that the children should do. And my subject was not mentioned as a subject of any importance. So I realized what situation I was in.
So what were your principles for education then?
Well, my principles were still developing at that stage, but I certainly had come to the conclusion that conventional teaching wasn't adequately stimulating for young people. That, you know, school should have a certain enjoyment, even thrill, to go to, and I could try to create that in the classroom. Not always easy, because at the end of the day, there were exams to be taken and tests to be taken. And I always felt that it was a rather ludicrous practice to test pieces of artwork and rank them one above another, and rank children one above the other. And I believe that that sort of teaching creates a sense of failure in so many of young people who have enormous potential that is taken away from them because they're in a ranking system of who succeeds and who fails.
So your next school after Acklam was
Stapleton School, and Beryl had been to a meeting of art teachers, and it was addressed by Stuart Wilson, who was a head teacher of Stapleton, which was much further east than in Middlesbrough. And she said, you need to be working with Stuart Wilson because he shares your principles and enthusiasm for, creating schools that are more stimulating and more exciting for kids that they enjoy going to. And strangely, at the same time, a job came up, and I went to work with Stuart Wilson in Stapleton, and it was possible to have a freer range on creating stimulating art departments and being creative about the potential of what could be done. And but again, there's still a limit, because at the end of the day, these kids have got to pass an examination for, success or failure. However, at the time, I was very closely befriended with Bill Hall, who was working in the church, but he was looking to develop a centre where people could come together and share concepts about society and in, whatever direction it should be taken. And he was very good at bringing people together from different walks of life and getting them round the table. And on one occasion, he'd brought an educationist from Nottinghamshire to give a talk about what his concepts were of the next type of school. And at that meeting, I looked to see what he was doing and listened to what he had to say, and realized that, in fact, the school of the future was beginning to happen, and it could happen. And amazing coincidence is that a few months later, working still at Stuart Wilson's school, he brought all the staff together and announced that he had taken a new job. But he didn't describe what it was, but he said it was an opportunity that he could not miss, because he'd fulfilled all his ambitions of teaching and running schools. And he invited staff to come and talk to him. And I told him at the time, I think you've got the job at Sutton Centre, haven't you? He said, how did he know that? I said, I just worked it out. And so when Sutton Centre was set up, I went with Stuart Wilson. And this was a brand new school, of which the Director of Education of Nottinghamshire at the time had given Stuart Wilson a blank sheet of paper to set out how the school should be run.
Can we just put it in perspective where Sutton-in-Ashfield is?
Well, Sutton-in-Ashfield is towards the west side of Nottinghamshire, not far from the borders with Derbyshire. The main town near to Sutton is Mansfield, which is about 10 miles away from Sutton. But Sutton-in-Ashfield existed basically because it was one of the mining communities of Nottinghamshire.
Yeah. So you were attracted by the Nottingham Education Department, was it, in 1973?
Yeah, 1972 I went. It started in 1973, but amazingly, we had a whole year to set up the school. And the senior staff were all appointed during that year before the school actually opened. But it was exciting because we did start from scratch, and we were in agreement that the 45 minute teaching period was really a very negative experience for most children and teachers. What tends to happen is you get the attention of the kids, you deliver what you have to teach, and you've got to get it finished by the end of the lesson and give out homework. And this was happening up and down the country, everywhere. And we agreed that the best answer to that was teach in blocks. So each department would have a whole morning or a whole afternoon. And that meant that the teachers had to develop a relationship with the students that they were teaching. It was no longer a sort of passing relationship that had to be hurried through in 45 minutes. And it meant that the teacher had to work really hard to engage the kids, and also to ensure that there was continuity throughout a period of what could be 2 hours or 2.5 hours. There had to be continuity in development. So, that was one of the fundamentals of Sutton Centre, which was very important. There were many others. I mean, another one was the fact that we decided that having a 2-tier system of exams was not appropriate. So we banished the idea of GCE and CSE for the less able. And what we did was we developed CSE into a CSE Mode 3, where the school was responsible for setting the whole syllabus and also assessing the children, with outside assessors to come in and check that everything was okay. In order to make this acceptable locally, we contacted all the industry and all the employers, universities and colleges, and nobody objected to what we were doing. And my personal situation was, for me, really quite special, because I'd provided a sort of common denominator in the teaching of the school by proposing a Department of Communication and Resources. And we had the children, young people, for a whole week, from Monday till Friday. This gave the teachers occasionally a session where they could do preparation or whatever, because they didn't have their class for one session. And communication resources was, the idea was basically to help children practice and exercise taking responsibility for their own research, doing questionnaires, going out into the town, developing a project, using various aspects of resources, using the library, using a dark room, film cameras, photography. And at the end of the week, all the members of the class delivered to the rest of the groups, what they had been studying during the week. And to me, this provided all the essence of what I believed should be happening in secondary education. The responsibility of the activity is thrown onto the child, not that they were being taught at, but they were having to make decisions and question what they were doing, and learn how to present and transfer their findings to other people as well. So there were a lot of factors in it that gave me great pleasure.
How did the relationship work with the Nottingham Education Department and the State Education Department and Sutton Centre with regards to decision making?
Well, we had been given by the Director of Education the white sheet of paper, so we were given incredible trust. And what the school decided to do was to set up a research project so that somebody was looking at what we were doing to sort of transform the education process. And so Professor Colin Fletcher came in with his team, and they happened to have an office just outside of my classroom, off my classroom. And their job was to, make an assessment of what we were doing. After 5 years, there was a change with the local authority, because they decided that Sutton Centre would absorb the secondary schools that existed in Sutton-in-Ashfield, and so basically become the school for Sutton-in-Ashfield. And that unfortunately caused some difficulties, because some of the parents were able to get their children to a grammar school in Mansfield, and this was no longer possible, because they were now saying they would not be going to Mansfield, they would be going to Sutton Centre. So the original principle, which was really on the white sheet of paper, had to take on other unexpected demands by absorbing teachers and also kids that were already from other schools.
One of the key components of setting the school up was that you were given a remit to employ teachers from any county in England or Wales, which was unheard of at that time.
Yes. At that time, largely, when they appointed anybody to teaching posts and new teaching posts, they were called ring-fenced. That meant you could only choose from people in the area. And for Sutton Centre, Stuart Wilson was given the rights to choose from the whole country. So the adverts for the jobs went countrywide. So it was a very interesting group of people that first came in to work at Sutton Centre, because they'd been handpicked from all over the country.
I mean, I was quite young at that particular time, being 6 when we moved to Sutton-in-Ashfield. But one of the key components of Sutton Centre, which is why it maybe worked, was that it was right in town centre, so it became the focal point for the community.
Yeah. Well, the architect of Sutton Centre worked closely with the Director of Education, James Stone. And between them, they researched the town and even went to stay in the town to talk to the local people in the local pubs and clubs and coffee bars, etc., to find out what people needed. So, they did the footwork to come up with their concept. Normally, schools are built on the outsides of towns where, kids have got to sometimes take buses, etc. But the idea of Sutton Centre was to place it right in the centre, and there was a shopping precinct, so that Sutton Centre, the school, was really an adjunct to the shopping centre right in the centre of Sutton-in-Ashfield. So that was a deliberate choice to make it connect with the community, because Sutton Centre as a building was not just a school, it was a whole range of services and other facilities, including sports facilities, theatre, senior citizens centre, youth club. All of those things were thrown into this same building so that they could connect and be accessible to the public.
You missed the library house as well.
Pardon?
There was a library.
There was a library.
Yeah.
There was already a library, but that wasn't in Sutton Centre. It was part of the precinct.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was that? Was it not on the when you went through from the car park area? Was that not the library on the left-hand side?
No.
No.
No. If you went from Sutton Centre and you walked towards the precinct, you walked right through the precinct to the far side, almost the main road, and the library was as you exit on the other side of the precinct.
Yeah. So the whose decision then was it to open it up as a commercial entity with regards sports and the ice rink and the sports hall, the table tennis?
Well, that was the director of education and the architect had obviously involved other agencies and come up with a conclusion of making the whole place a comprehensive complex, because the sports area also had ice skating, bowls, and all the other facilities. Like there was a separate swimming pool in Sutton-in-Ashfield, so there was no swimming pool in the complex, but there was a huge sports centre, as it were, which was directly connected to the school. They also added on at a later stage the probation services. So the probation services, who need to work closely with schools, also came into the building, but that was after my time.
So one of the key things was obviously getting the community involved. How did he set about that?
Well, in terms of the school itself, we started off by agreeing with all teachers that they would have what we called a tutor group, so that, and it would be no larger than 24. So each teacher, when the young people came into the school, will be given a group of 24 to take responsibility for throughout the school. And one of the other agreements which the teachers agreed to do was that they would make sure that they had contact with the parents of each child, even to the point of home visits. So I know that with my tutor group, I visited everybody's home where I was allowed in, and met up with the parents and tried to explain, what the principles were behind the school, and remain in contact if they ever had any needs. And then we produced, instead of reports that just went out by teachers on each child, we produced a profile. And the profile was written by each subject teacher and also the tutor, but also with spaces for comment, the parents to comment as well. So on that level, the parents were part of the triangle: child, school, parent. So we're trying to strengthen those links. And that would mean that the parents were much better informed as to, what the purpose of the school was, what potential there is, and, how they could make use of it as well. There was one other thing as well. Yes. I've forgotten. Go on.
So you introduced something which was known as 11th session.
Yeah.
Which was nighttime education for all.
We did, yeah, well remembered, yes, yeah. We each department would offer an 11th session, 10 sessions during the week, morning, afternoon, and then one in the evening, and that was called the 11th session, which children could come to, young people of the school, parents, adults. So, it was open to the public. So that's another way for, the community to get to know what the possibilities were.
So if your time at Sutton Centre was 72 to 78, it opened in 1973. In those 5 years that it was open, what were the successes that you think that you connect to Sutton Centre?
I think the successes were the things that I've referred to already, that there was much closer contact and knowledge of each student and responsibility for, the social welfare of each student, because there were contacts with parents. And I think that was probably the main success. I think also the quality of teaching was so much more inspired, because teachers were not just teaching by rote, but had to work out how to teach for 2.5 hours continuously, which primary school teachers do all the time, but secondary teachers, historically have taught lessons for 45 minutes and then switch off. So there's a couple of things there.
So in 1977, there was a change of the control of the local council. It went from Labour to Conservative. And then there was a very public court case with regards a teacher in Sutton Centre. And things changed for the school at that point. Is that fair to say?
It's not fair to say that the court case really had significant impact on the way the school was going. What happened was it was a change of political control of the whole of Nottinghamshire, not just the council. It was Nottinghamshire County Council, and the Director of Education is answerable to the council, and the council had changed, and his ideas, his principles were now no longer of any relevance, because the Education Committee decide which direction the county is going. So they had very soon after coming into power had highlighted where they wanted changes, and they did not want schools like Sutton Centre within their system. It was a threat to them. And what happened is the local people whose children were now having to go to the school and were not able to go to selective schools set up a committee to find fault with the school. And Stuart Wilson was called to a meeting of the Education Committee, and he was presented with about 10 criticisms, which were basically not superficial. There weren't criticisms in depth. There were things like children had to walk to the playing fields and might get wet. Things of that sort were the 10 complaints. And according to the Director of Education, who did speak to Stuart Wilson afterwards, he said, well, you answered all the questions very well. But Stuart pointed out that the education committee itself actually weren't listening to what he was saying. They were talking amongst themselves. And when the meeting was over, he was told by the leader of the County Council Education Committee that he should return to the school and remain incommunicado. Don't talk to anybody about what's happened at this meeting. And to follow, there will be an in-depth inquiry into how you run the school. So Stuart Wilson returned to Sutton Centre and called a public meeting and explained everything that was happening to members of the public who came in, which were largely parents, because, you know, they were now committed to the school and connected to the school. And from that point onwards, the school was under threat, because the people stirring up the trouble were quick to call certain newspapers, and national newspapers were standing outside the door trying to get in. And of course, we had an open plan school, and it was very difficult to sustain that privacy from reporters who wanted to put a particular angle on the school. And I know that Stuart Wilson, his face was on page 3 of the Sun, next to the lady who had no clothes on. But it was about, you know, the school of shame, really. And what was going to happen next is that there was going to be this in-depth inquiry. And we learned that the inquiry was going to be run by a number of chosen people. One was a retired primary headmaster, another one was a local butcher, another one. Local people were going to carry out this investigation. However, Barbara Castle, I think it's Barbara Castle. Shirley Williams, sorry, you got the wrong one. Keep me right. She brought it up in the House of Commons that this disgraceful inquiry was happening, which wasn't official. And she organised, or it was organised, that all senior inspectors of England would drop their programme and go straight to Sutton Centre. So within a fortnight, all the senior inspectors were in the school doing the inspection. And by that way, it meant that an inquiry, you know, which was, you know, organised locally, really had no teeth at all. It did happen, but the findings of the local inquiry never got printed. They ran it in the local swimming pool and invited people to come and complain, you know, but they never printed it, because the school got a good bill of health from the chief inspectors of schooling for England. And at that point, Scottish education was undergoing a bit of a revolution in Aberdeen and in the Lothian region and Edinburgh. And they wanted what we were doing in Sutton Centre. And they came down and poached Stuart Wilson to go and open a new school in Livingston. And he realised that the writing was on the wall for you know, his career and what was going to happen to the school.
Before we go to Scotland, was there any other similar schools in England and Wales happening at the time of Sutton Centre?
Yeah. Leicestershire was also trying to break some of the, you know, historic patterns of standard schools. with Countersthorpe in Leicestershire. So Leicestershire was quite forward. Also, we're starting similar thoughts in Birmingham, but I don't know how far they got with it. And one or two schools were very close to adopting some of our principles with the examination structure. But having moved to Scotland, I don't know how that was resolved.
So it's 1978. You moved up to Livingston in round about the Easter time.
Yeah.
We moved up as a family in the summer of 78. Tell us a bit about Livingston at that particular time, because it's a Scottish new town, one of 5, and the older that you get, or the older that I've got, you realise that new towns are built in 3 stages. So building houses, getting people there, and then finding them jobs. So when we moved there was a lot of building new houses, and there was a lot of new people moving to Livingston.
Yes, it was at stage 1, really. I mean, it'd been going for a good 5 to 10 years of development, but it was mostly housing, and the infrastructure wasn't there. I mean, that's why they needed a school as well. They already had 1 or 2 schools, but there were no supermarkets. There were no services locally. Only the occasional pub and the occasional shop. So it was very limited. But whilst we were there, that process developed further. The Armandvale Centre got built. So it had a shopping centre, but it was very much, about providing housing and taking people away from the poorer housing in Glasgow or the poorer housing in Edinburgh.
So we moved there 78. You had a piece of land where you could build a new school at. Were you involved in the remit of how the school was built and laid out?
No, not at, well. I had a say at the final stages of room usage, but all the spaces were allocated by the architect. A group of architects from Glasgow had been appointed to design the school, but my connections were with Martin Garden, who was an architect who worked on schools with the Lothian region, and it was actually it was with the government. He was working with the government at the time, and his remit was school building. So he was the link, between progressive thinking in schools and the architect. So they worked hand in hand to produce Dean's Community High School. When I arrived, the building was already there, and it was starting to be staffed. Janitors were already in it, and I was able to do some adjustments of how rooms would be used in a resource centre. But other than that, the job was done.
So the one of the key differences between Sutton Centre and Dean's Community High School was the location. So rather than Sutton Centre being right in the centre of the community, Dean's Community High School was out on a wing, which was surrounded
typically
by fields.
on the periphery. Periphery. Yes, out in the country, in fact.
Yeah.
So yes, it didn't have that feature of being a community hub with convenience. Not that it was a long journey, but on the other hand, it wasn't a natural central the position wasn't a natural position.
Was the remit to replicate what you did in Sutton Centre, or were you to introduce other disciplines and features?
No, but the difference was there was no blank sheet of paper to actually create, how the structure of teaching and departmental structure would happen. So in Sutton Centre, we were able to put personal and social education in a group together, which meant pulling together existing subjects and European studies, which included all languages together, and also history and geography. We weren't able to do that in Scotland because there's a very strong union structure of set up by the teachers, which identifies, how departments exist. And we tried to bring business studies, history and geography under one umbrella, but it was not possible because each of those areas had its own equal principle for each subject, and it had to stay like that. However, we did attempt to set up a tutorial system, like each teacher had responsibility for a group of children throughout their school career. But we couldn't take it as far as it was possible in Sutton-in-Ashfield. There certainly wasn't a practice of home visits to parents.
But you ran a similar log of your educational achievements, and not gradings, but reviews by teachers and by your parents.
Well, I mean, what we did was try to infuse the concept that we had to incorporate parents into the practices of the school as far as we could. But because the school was on the periphery and many of the teachers came from Edinburgh, you couldn't exactly expect them to go around doing, home visits, because they were living in a different part of the world. So we couldn't replicate Sutton Centre, but of course we, tried to make as much impact on parental contact as we could.
One of the key differences between Deans and Sutton Centre was that you could only employ from within the Lothian region, which meant that you couldn't look at further afield in Scotland to attract similar-minded teachers like you could in
Sutton Centre. Yes, it was ring fenced. We could only employ from the Lothian region. I don't think that was sacrosanct, but generally it was the case. And also the directors of the areas of Lothian region had a great part to play in who got what job. So, people would be nominated for a job that came from the Director of Education. At Sutton Centre, there was absolutely no interference whatsoever with, who was going to be on the staff. So there were certainly lists already about who would get jobs at Dean's Community High School.
So what year did Stuart Wilson leave Dean's?
I'd have to make a guess at that because I can't remember precisely, but it would be about 88.
Okay. So did the school change for you at that point?
Not dramatically. I mean, the sort of overall culture and patterns of operation didn't really change much over the years. There was a great resistance. Stuart Wilson was far too dynamic for many of the teachers because he wanted more out of them and more investment in the kids. So he would come up with ideas and new concepts. He brought in breakfast clubs and things of that sort, which the teachers, many of the teachers didn't want to do and felt it was outside of their contract to push the boat out further than, deliver their pure form of teaching.
What do you think the successes of Dean's Community High School were during your time?
Well, I think a lot of the kids enjoyed their school. Not all of them, which in many other schools, I think they would be going in fear because Dean's Community High School declared unilaterally not to use corporal punishment, and it was the first one in Scotland that had actually declared it. Other schools were still using the tawse, and corporal punishment was still rife in certain parts of Scotland. And I think, having taken that away, there was a sort of air of interest in the kids that wasn't necessarily present in other schools that they'd been to. What I was proud of is the fact that staff were staff, and it wasn't a hierarchy of teachers with the staff being servile to the needs of the teachers and the teaching. The resource centre staff, library staff, office staff, etc., I think were much higher valued. Even the cleaners. Stuart Wilson took the cleaners out for their annual celebration. That's the headmaster taking them out. That won't happen in many schools, I don't think.
So you retired in 1995, maybe 96.
Well, I was seconded, you see, for 2 years or 3 years, 3 years before I actually retired. So I was seconded to, first of all, work in a head teacher training unit invited by Andrew Bruce. So I worked in there as a resource manager. And then I was seconded to work in Leith Academy, which was a brand new building built on the principles that school buildings needed to change. And it was really quite an exciting prospect. And then I worked as a resource manager for the Education Authority itself for the last year.
So how do you view education now compared to education whilst you were teaching?
I think an anecdote of my teaching experience, my last teaching experience, I was teaching media studies, and my version of media studies was to make it practical, to make it real, and to give it meaning for the young people who chose to do media studies. And most of them were the ones that are non-academic, who didn't choose to do things to do with science, maths and English. and I used television cameras to make television programs with them. And they were either documentary or they were like storytelling or whatever. And at the end of each term, we broadcast to the rest of the school on the last day for a whole morning. And we included the things that the students had created themselves. We had presenters, set designers, camera operators, mixers. You know, they were all kids working away in a proper studio, broadcasting to their friends who were, because the school was connected up with low battery. And when I was doing this media studies, there was a pilot scheme across Scotland, a national pilot scheme. And we'd been heard of what we were doing, so we were invited to do it. And in the pilot scheme, there were schools from all over Scotland, primary and secondary, and we went to each other's school to look at what they were doing. And they came to Dean's Community High School. And they sat in the audience whilst we presented our television programs. And at the end of it, shortly afterwards, Dean's and I was invited to present at the final summary of this annual pilot scheme in Glasgow to an audience. So we were chosen out of all the other schools to do the presentation. I presented really what my principles were about teaching, about engaging children in real things, getting them to take responsibility for their actions, connecting with each other, learning how to collaborate, learning how to cooperate, learning how to discuss, you know, how to work things out together, etc., etc. So I presented this to all the key representatives from across the country. At the end of it, there were questions, but nothing of any other than you're doing a good job, keep it up, type of response. Before I left the school, within the next year, the syllabus came out for media studies, and it was totally academic. It was all about reading, watching television programs, writing up about it, and nothing about the practical experience of young children working together. So, I mean, that is the story. That is what is happening to education. That throughout my education and my teaching, there were teachers who were able to innovate with children, do new things, excite them, and go off the track and enthuse kids with things. But the syllabus has now been watered down to a government exercise that everybody needs to follow. Not so much in Scotland as in England. Now, the arts and the creative things and the extracurricular things are being removed from schools to make it seriously an exam factory in every school that competes against every other school. So the idea of introducing innovation, creativity, imagination is lost to young children in all of those school years.